London in the mid-1960s was the center of the world. It was a cultural supernova, a city vibrating with the energy of a new generation. It was the era of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, of miniskirts and Carnaby Street, of photographers and models reshaping the global aesthetic. The world looked at London and saw a technicolor dream of freedom and artistic revolution. But if you peeled back that glossy, vibrant layer, if you looked past the fashion shoots and the pop charts, you found a different city entirely. You found a city of grey cobblestones, damp alleyways, and terraced houses that had barely changed since the Victorian era. This was the East End, and in this kingdom of shadows, the rulers were not politicians or rock stars. They were two brothers, identical twins who wore bespoke Italian suits and possessed a terrifying aura of absolute authority. They were Ronnie and Reggie Kray. To understand the events that unfolded on a cold March evening in 1966, one must first understand the unique position the Kray twins occupied. They were not merely criminals operating in the dark. They were celebrities. They owned nightclubs in the West End, where lords and ladies rubbed shoulders with rough-edged men from the docks. They were photographed by the most famous artists of the day. They were a brand. The firm, as their organization was known, was run with corporate efficiency. Reggie was the businessman, the charming face of the operation, who could negotiate deals and manage the books. But Ronnie was different. Ronnie was the colonel. Ronnie was the force of chaos that kept the entire underworld in a state of suspended terror. Ronnie Kray lived in a world defined by paranoia and a craving for a very specific type of respect. While Reggie wanted to be a legitimate businessman who just happened to be a gangster, Ronnie wanted to be a warlord. He idolized historical figures, warriors, and leaders who ruled with an iron fist. He suffered from mental health struggles that in today's world would be diagnosed and treated, but in the rough and tumble world of 1960s London were simply seen as eccentricity or madness. This instability made him unpredictable, and in the underworld, unpredictability is the most dangerous currency of all. You knew where you stood with a man who wanted money. You never knew where you stood with a man who wanted to be Al Capone. The ecosystem of London crime was delicate. The East End belonged to the Krays, but South London belonged to another family, the Richardsons. The torture gangs, as they were grimly known, were formidable rivals. They were scrap metal merchants by day and ruthless enforcers by night. The tension between the Krays and the Richardsons was the Cold War of the London streets. It was a standoff that everyone knew would eventually turn hot. And caught in the middle of this clash of titans was a man named George Cornell. George Cornell was not a civilian. He was a face. He was a senior enforcer for the Richardson gang, a man with a reputation for toughness that was well earned. He was a hard man from the old school, loyal to his bosses in South London, and he held a deep simmering contempt for the Krays. Cornell viewed the twins, particularly Ronnie, as pretenders. He saw their celebrity status, their posing for photos, and their desire to mix with high society as a weakness. To a man like Cornell, gangsters belonged in the shadows, not on the front pages of the tabloids. The friction between George Cornell and Ronnie Kray was not just business, it was intensely personal. It stemmed from a clash of personalities and a series of slights that had festered over time. But the core of the issue lay in the insults. Cornell had a sharp tongue and a lack of filter, especially when he had been drinking. There had been incidents, confrontations in clubs where words were exchanged. Cornell had reportedly used derogatory terms to describe Ronnie, attacking his identity and his lifestyle in a way that was considered the ultimate taboo in the hyper-masculine environment of the East End. In a world where reputation was everything, these insults were not just rude, they were acts of war. They were challenges that struck at the very foundation of Ronnie's self-image. Ronnie Kray was obsessed with the concept of respect. To him, allowing a rival to mock him without consequence was a sign of weakness that could topple his entire empire. If the colonel could be insulted by a South London enforcer, then the firm was weak, and Ronnie Kray would rather see the world burn than be seen as weak. The date was March 9th, 1966. The day had been unremarkable, filled with the usual tension and low-level management of the firm's affairs. Ronnie was in a dark mood. Those who knew him best knew the signs: the distant stare, the brooding silence, the sudden shifts in temperament. He was feeling the pressure. The police were circling, the business was stressful, and the insults from the Richardson camp were replaying in his mind like a broken record. Word reached Ronnie that George Cornell was in the East End. This was a significant breach of protocol. In the unwritten treaties of the Underworld, you didn't just wander into rival territory without permission or a very good reason. Cornell was drinking at the Blind Beggar Pub on Whitechapel Road. The Blind Beggar was not just any pub. It was a local institution, deep in the heart of Kray territory. For Cornell to be there, drinking casually, was seen by Ronnie as a deliberate provocation. It was as if he was planting a flag in Ronnie's backyard and daring him to do something about it. It is important to visualize the setting. The Blind Beggar in 1966 was a traditional Victorian gin palace. High ceilings, etched glass, the smell of stale ale and tobacco smoke hanging heavy in the air. It was a place for locals, for dockers and market traders to unwind after a hard day. It was a sanctuary of the working class. On that night, the pub was moderately busy. There was music playing from the jukebox. The Walker Brothers hit "The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore," a song with a melancholic, soaring melody that would become forever linked to the tragedy that was about to occur. George Cornell was sitting at the bar. He was relaxed. He was in his element. He felt safe, perhaps because he believed that the rules of the game still applied. You didn't conduct business in a crowded public house. You didn't make a scene in front of civilians. He likely believed that the Krays, for all their posturing, wouldn't dare jeopardize their empire by doing something reckless in such a public forum. He underestimated the state of Ronnie's mind. Ronnie did not rush. The accounts of the evening suggest a cold, methodical preparation. He was with his driver and associate, Ian Barry. They gathered the necessary tools for the confrontation. Ronnie dressed for the occasion. He always did. Appearance was paramount. A dark suit, a crisp white shirt, a tie. He looked like a businessman going to a late meeting or an undertaker attending a service. The drive to the pub was short. The car pulled up near the curb. The streets of Whitechapel were dark, illuminated by the orange glow of the street lamps. Ronnie and Ian Barry stepped out of the vehicle. The air was crisp. Ronnie adjusted his jacket. He checked his pocket to ensure the instrument he had brought, a 9mm Luger, was accessible. He wasn't going there to talk. The time for talking had passed months ago when the first insult was uttered. They entered the pub. The atmosphere in a room changes when a predator enters. It is a primal instinct that humans still possess. The chatter at the tables didn't stop immediately, but a ripple of unease moved through the space. Heads turned. People recognized the twins instantly. They were the local royalty, but they also recognized the look on Ronnie's face. It was the Colonel look. Dead eyes behind heavy glasses. A set jaw. A complete absence of emotion. George Cornell was still at the bar, nursing his drink. He saw them come in. He saw Ronnie. This is the moment where history holds its breath. A rational man, realizing he is cornered by a rival he has antagonized, might try to flee. He might try to de-escalate. But Cornell was a hard man. To show fear was to lose. He stayed seated. He turned to face them. According to witnesses and later accounts, Cornell reacted with a smirk. He reportedly said, "Well, look who's here." It was a final act of defiance. Even in the face of immediate danger, he refused to show respect. He treated Ronnie's arrival as a joke. Ronnie Kray did not speak. He did not engage in a cinematic exchange of dialogue. He did not list his grievances. The insult had been the sentence. This was merely the execution. He walked calmly towards the bar. Ian Barry fired a warning device into the ceiling, a loud crack that shattered the ambient noise of the pub and sent the patrons diving for cover. The music from the jukebox kept playing, the soaring vocals of the Walker brothers providing a surreal soundtrack to the violence. Ronnie raised his arm. The motion was smooth, practiced. He pointed the 9mm directly at George Cornell. The distance was short. There was no chance of missing. The discharge of the device was deafening in the enclosed space. A single impact. George Cornell slumped forward. It was not a dramatic flailing fall, like in the Western movies Ronnie loved so much. It was the sudden cessation of life. The mechanics of the human body simply stopped functioning. One moment, a man with a history, a family, and a reputation. The next, a silent object resting against the bar. The entire incident had taken seconds. The pub was frozen in a state of absolute shock. The patrons were cowering under tables, unable to process the audacity of what they had just witnessed. A man had been ended in cold blood, in a public house, in the middle of the evening. Ronnie Kray stood there for a brief moment. He looked at the result of his action. He didn't check for a pulse. He didn't look around to see who was watching. He simply turned around and walked out. He walked out with the same calm, heavy gait with which he had entered. Ian Barry followed him. They got back into the car. The engine started. They drove away into the East End night, leaving behind a scene that would mark the beginning of the end for the Kray era. The immediate aftermath of the Blind Beggar incident was a study in fear. The police arrived to find a scene of chaos, but also a scene of silence. This was the East End code of silence, the omerta, taken to its extreme. Everyone in that pub knew who had walked in. Everyone knew who Ronnie Kray was. But when the detectives began to interview the witnesses, a collective amnesia descended upon Whitechapel. I didn't see anything. I was looking the other way. I was in the toilet. Fear is a powerful silencer. The reputation of the firm was such that nobody was willing to risk their safety to identify Ronnie. They knew that the Krays had reach. They knew that snitches didn't just get beaten. They disappeared. For weeks it seemed like Ronnie had gotten away with it. The police knew he did it. The streets knew he did it. But without a witness willing to stand up in court, there was no case. However, the psychological impact on Ronnie was complex. He didn't feel remorse in the traditional sense. He felt vindicated. He had silenced the voice that mocked him. He had re-established his dominance. He reportedly told associates that he felt bloody wonderful after the event. It was a release of the pressure that had been building up, but it also marked a shift in his behavior. The violence had worked. It had been easy. And when the ultimate taboo, taking a life in public, becomes easy, the descent into total chaos accelerates. For Reggie Kray, the businessman, this was a disaster. He understood what Ronnie didn't. You can't run a criminal empire if you bring that much heat on yourself. The Blind Beggar incident was too loud. It forced the police to escalate their efforts. It forced the government to take notice. You could ignore gambling dens and protection rackets, but you couldn't ignore an execution in a pub. It was an affront to the rule of law that the British establishment could not tolerate. The investigation into the Blind Beggar incident became a war of attrition. The lead detective, Leonard Nipper Reid, was obsessed with bringing the twins down. He knew that he couldn't just get them on a minor charge. He needed the big one. He needed the Blind Beggar case. He worked tirelessly to crack the wall of silence. He offered protection. He applied pressure. He waited for the cracks to appear in the firm's loyalty. And cracks did appear. The erratic behavior of the twins driven largely by Ronnie's declining mental state and the increasing paranoia of both brothers, began to alienate their own crew. The Blind Beggar was the catalyst. It showed the people working for the Krays that Ronnie was no longer just a gangster, he was a liability. He was dangerous to his own friends. If he could walk into a pub and end a man over an insult, what would he stop him from turning on a loyal lieutenant who made a minor mistake? The invincibility of the Krays was an illusion, and that illusion was shattered by the very act that Ronnie thought would strengthen it. The respect he craved was replaced by terror, and terror is a fragile foundation for loyalty. People follow a leader they respect. They flee from a leader they fear as soon as they see an exit. Eventually, the law caught up. The wall of silence was chipped away, not by the brave barmaid who famously refused to testify initially, but later did, but by the collapse of the entire organization from within. When the twins were finally arrested in 1968, the Blind Beggar incident was the centerpiece of the prosecution. It was the undeniable proof of their ruthlessness. The trial was a sensation. But when the details were read out, when the cold, factual account of that night was presented to the jury, the glamour faded. The celebrity gangsters were revealed to be what they truly were: brutal men who visited extreme violence upon those who crossed them. Ronnie Kray was sentenced to life imprisonment, eventually being certified insane and spending the rest of his days in Broadmoor Hospital. But why does this story endure? Why, decades later, are we still fascinated by the image of Ronnie Kray walking into that pub? It endures because it is the ultimate example of the collision between ego and reality. The title of this story captures the essence. A gangster mocked Ronnie Kray, right in front of them. The mockery was the trigger. In a normal world, an insult is just words. You brush it off, you move on. But in the distorted reality of the heavy-duty underworld, an insult is a physical object. It is a weapon used to dismantle a man's standing. George Cornell didn't just call Ronnie a name. He tried to devalue his stock in a market where stock is the only thing that keeps you alive. And the reaction? And that's what he did, in front of everyone. Speaks to the performative nature of Ronnie's violence. He didn't wait for Cornell to leave the pub. He didn't ambush him in a dark alley. He did it in the light. He did it in front of the audience. He needed the witnesses. He needed the story to spread. He wanted the world to know that the penalty for disrespect was absolute and immediate termination. The tragedy, of course, is that in seeking to cement his legend as the untouchable Colonel, Ronnie Kray wrote the first chapter of his own downfall. He proved that he was the toughest man in the room, yes, but he also proved that he was incompatible with the modern world. You cannot act like a medieval king in a 20th century city and expect to remain free. The Blind Beggar Pub still stands today. It is a tourist attraction, a pilgrimage site for those obsessed with true crime. People go there, buy a pint, and look at the spot where George Cornell sat. They try to imagine the smoke, the jukebox, the tension. They try to conjure the ghosts of 1966. But stripped of the nostalgia, the story is a grim reminder of the fragility of life. George Cornell woke up that morning, put on his clothes, and went about his day. He didn't know it was his last. He didn't know that a few words spoken in a moment of arrogance would lead to such a final conclusion. He made a calculation that his status would protect him. He was wrong. And Ronnie Kray? He got what he wanted. He got his legend. He is remembered as the most frightening man in British criminal history. But the price was everything else. He traded his freedom, his empire, and his life for that moment of silence in the pub. When we look back at this event, we must be careful not to glorify it. It wasn't a movie scene. It was a brutal, ugly act. A man was taken from his family. A community was traumatized. But as a piece of history, it serves as a powerful lesson on the nature of pride. The code of the street suggests that you must answer every insult with force. But the Blind Beggar incident shows the flaw in that code. The force used was so excessive, so public, that it destroyed the user as much as the victim. It was a mutually assured destruction. In the end, the silence that followed the shot was not just the silence of the witnesses. It was the silence of a future that never happened. A future where the Krays might have gone legitimate, or where George Cornell might have retired to the coast. All those futures were cancelled in the split second it took for a mechanism to fire and a projectile to fly. The story of Ronnie Kray and George Cornell is a dark parable. It tells us that words have weight. It tells us that there are people in this world for whom respect is a matter of life and death. And it tells us that sometimes the scariest thing in the world isn't the monster under the bed, but the man in the bespoke suit walking through the door of your local pub. This was not a duel. It was not a fight. It was a statement. A statement written in the permanent ink of violence. And the message was clear. In the world of Ronnie Kray, you could be a rival, you could be an enemy, but you could never ever be a critic. The penalty for criticism was to be erased, and that is exactly what happened. Immediately, in front of everyone. The legacy of that night hangs over the East End like a fog that never quite lifts. It changed the rules of the game. It brought the end of the gentleman gangster and ushered in a harsher, colder reality. It proved that the monsters were real, and they didn't care who was watching. As we analyze this from a factual standpoint, we see the mechanics of the downfall. We see the hubris. We see the mental instability unchecked by friends or family. And we see the victim, frozen in time, forever sitting at the bar, forever about to make the remark that would end his journey. It is a story of immediate consequence. There was no trial by combat. There was no negotiation. There was only the insult and the response. It is a terrifyingly simple equation, and in its simplicity lies its horror. So when the history books talk about the swinging 60s, about the colors and the music and the freedom, remember that in the shadows of that bright era, a jukebox was playing "The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore." And for George Cornell, it never did again. The lights went out, and the legend of the Kray Twins was sealed in the darkness of that room. A darkness that, in many ways, has never truly lifted.